Now, Agamemnon's was a continental power, and he could not have been master of any except the adjacent islands, and these would not be many, but through the possession of a fleet. And from this expedition we may infer the character of earlier enterprises. Now, Mycenae may have been a small place, and many of the towns of that age may appear comparatively insignificant, but no exact observer would therefore feel justified in rejecting the estimate given by the poets and by tradition of the magnitude of the armament. For I suppose if Lacedaemon were to become desolate, and the temples and the foundations of the public buildings were left, that as time went on there would be a strong disposition with posterity to refuse to accept her fame as a true exponent of her power. Hi, hello, welcome once again to Let's Talk About Myths, Baby, the podcast whose title is deceiving right now, particularly during this month's series. I'm your host, Liv, here once more with history of the Bronze Age people of Greece, nestled amongst their own mythical history. That quote I just read, like those I've read before for this series, was from the classical Athenian historian Thucydides, from his work detailing the Peloponnesian War. But once more, he serves as a beautiful example of the way that ancient Greece's mythical origins remained very real to later Greek authors who had, in the case of Mycenae, only what remained of a once great palace and the stories of Agamemnon and Menelaus that the poets had given to them centuries earlier. This line of Tantalids and their war against Troy. And it's only through this which they could parse the Bronze Age culture's lost history. In the case of that particular quote, it's him trying to fathom how the Achaeans and Agamemnon had so many men and ships to send to Troy when the Mycenae that was left by his time was quite so small. Last week, we looked at how we know what we know of Bronze Age Greece, some of the wider Mediterranean, and how it ties with ancient Greece's own mythologized versions of history. And specifically, the Minoans we looked at, the Bronze Age people from Crete, and their labyrinthine, bull-decorated palace of Knossos. As I mentioned then, the Minoans came first, but they were followed close behind by Mycenae, the culture on the mainland of Greece, centered in the Peloponnese, which grew under the inspiration of the Minoans and came to be quite closely tied with them through trade and shared influence. So today we are moving over to the mainland and looking at those Mycenaeans during this period. And then on Friday, an episode with Dr. Kim Shelton, whose expertise on Mycenae made for an incredible and utterly mind-blowing episode on the culture and religion and what we know of these ancient people. But before we listen to that expertise, we are going to get comfortable in this world of Mycenae, a world which was later mythologized into the famed home of Agamemnon and his children, the curse of his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather, where a king is murdered by his wife while taking a bath because he had the audacity to sacrifice their eldest daughter for a bit of good wind, a place where the first red carpet was rolled out by that very wife, only that one was red with the king's blood. The real Mycenae is perhaps less dramatic than Agamemnon's Mycenae, but all the more interesting because it was, well, real, and hopefully featured fewer attempts to trick people into eating children. Though I suppose we'll never know for sure. This is episode 257, Under the Shadow of Agamemnon, the Real Bronze Age Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans are an exciting people to look at, not only for the plethora of mythological connections that we can find, but also as the more explicit origins of the later archaic and classical age Greeks. That's kind of the wild thing about the Mycenaeans as a whole, how much of what was going on the mainland at the time was a precedent for what would later happen. It's interesting to look at these similarities and differences when thinking about how culture develops over centuries of progress. Through Mycenae, we get this sense that the evolution and development of culture moves from the bottom up. Because, as we will look at during the collapse episodes, what's really lost in that collapse isn't the culture itself, but the centralization of it and its power. It's the elites and the most upper echelons of society that were really lost during the collapse. And what was left and what persisted afterwards was the real, everyday people who were able to go on with their lives, who were able to adjust and adapt to these major changes because they were themselves not rich and elite and so weren't affected in the same way. It tends to be, particularly when we're looking at this kind of culture where the written record is minimal and limited entirely to the elite palatial structure, all that's left behind is the remnants of those elites. And so it looked like the culture itself was lost for a long time, but it was only the lasting material record that was often lost, and not the people themselves. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We are going to stick with the Mycenaeans during the Bronze Age for this one. There's a lot to look at. They were a rich culture, both literally and figuratively, one that we could spend hours on, but we will not. Firstly, a couple of quick reminders from last week's episode. Linear A and Linear B are the two Proto-Greek languages that I will refer to most. Linear A originated on Crete and Linear B on the mainland, though Crete eventually began using Linear B as well. And that's lucky because Linear B is decipherable today, whereas Linear A is still lost in translation, as it were. Both writing systems are predominantly found in palatial record-keeping, where the clay blocks they were inscribed on were preserved by fires, like makeshift kilns that are cherished by modern historians. There were many Mycenaean sites across the mainland of Greece, from the Peloponnese into Attica, Boeotia, and beyond. They were just as intensely connected with the rest of the Mediterranean as the Minoans, like we talked about last week, and of course had a very lovely little relationship with those Minoans in particular. But I digress, we will get there. The Mycenaeans had as humble a beginning as the Minoans. Across the mainland, there were groups of people living and going about life just as they were on the island during the early Bronze Age, before any kind of centralization. And you may wonder how we know what we do know for this time period. There wasn't any writing in Greece at all yet. We have no textual evidence. So what are we left with? Well, again, this is where all those archaeologically inclined will get excited. The majority of evidence from these earliest time periods, and in fact how we get most of our relative chronology, like dating in general, is through pottery. And isn't that delightful? Scholars who are considerably more knowledgeable on this topic than I am could explain it much better, but basically through patterns in morphology, decoration, depiction of fabrics, etc., archaeologists have been able to map the changes and figure out roughly the time frame for this period. And while the pottery that is found during this time is not as impressively stunning as what we might find later in the archaic and classical periods and beyond, I think that you'd be surprised just how sophisticated it was. I mean, I have the Minoans mostly in my head at all times, but think Bronze Age octopus. There were identifiable workshops all across the mainland, all the way from Thrace down to Attica and into the Peloponnese, even on the island Aegean, tucked away in the Saronic Gulf between the Peloponnese and Attica. The study of pottery from this time period does more than help us figure out relative chronology. It also shows us the level of connection and specialization that was happening during this period. Workshop sites found in some central Greek locations even demonstrate that at this period there was a truly wild amount of specialization happening, with specific pieces being made at specific sites and then which moved around the mainland and beyond. Truly the level of information that we can get from pottery alone is astounding, and really goes to show that, even at the earliest periods of the Bronze Age in the Aegean, there was a substantial amount of connection taking place amongst the people. And as we move through the early Bronze Age period on the mainland, we also start to see signs of what we should probably consider as a migration happening. This movement is combined with more fortifications that are happening at sites, evidence of people settling in and protecting themselves against outside threats. This isn't quite the heavy fortification of the later Bronze Age, but we do start to see sites building up a bit more as the early period moves on. And there's also evidence of migration through the burial sites, which are incredibly important for our knowledge of the Mycenaeans broadly. This is something that Friday's conversation will go into in much more detail, so I won't stay too long on the early Bronze Age and these burials, as I really want to get into the major sites that we're all familiar with. But what I'm hoping you take away from this is, from the beginning of it all, we are seeing the same themes that we saw while on Crete last week. Those being movement of people, interconnectivity between communities, both near and far, and just this vast amount of connection across the land. The Mycenaeans during the Middle Helladic period, which is around the 18th century BCE, were vastly different from what we saw on Crete. While on Crete, we start to see the emergence and growth of their palatial period, what we see on the mainland is almost like a mini collapse of sorts. This is coming long before their own palatial period. While this little mini collapse does lead towards the later palatial period of the Mycenaeans, it is important to spend some time with this period because it sets up later citadels and palaces that we see into the later Helladic period. We won't be here long, just long enough to get the lay of the land. And I am having to be, unfortunately, brief, and I'm trying not to bog you all down with dates too much, but I hope you get the sense of the time period we are looking at, just how ancient this was. So I mentioned this little mini collapse, but also that the time period that preceded it was, seemed to be going pretty well. There was a growth of community, interconnectivity between these various areas, and the fortification of other areas, which at least tells us that there are people that care about where they're living and, care about protecting that space. And yet we see this period followed by this other period of destruction and depopulation, at least in the southern mainland. This distinction is important, of course, like later ancient Greece, it's really easy to bundle all these communities of the mainland under this one umbrella of Mycenaean or mainland. But this isn't really fair or accurate. The mainland, like later Greece, was an area that housed multitude of people that had differences across the communities, just as we wouldn't say that, classical period Thebans were like the Spartans in any meaningful way. We aren't going to do that with the people living in the Peloponnese and in Attica and Boeotia and beyond during this Bronze Age. Sure, they share some similarities, but not to the degree that we can comfortably say that they're all facing the same influences and pressures and threats. Because, why would they? They're in very different places, and so they are just facing very different issues, no matter how similar they might also be. The destructions I mentioned were likely caused by a variety of factors. While a migration of people could influence these destructive events, they were likely, environmental changes that were also happening and influenced them. Stuff like erosion and land degradation causes, serious difficulties for a group of people that heavily rely on that land in order to sustain themselves. These sorts of difficulties cause people to move around, trying to find a better way of life, better places to live and grow and everything, and they heavily contribute to the changes that are happening during this period. And of course, we don't have a record of what was actually happening, just what evidence was left behind in which we can then try to piece together some form of explanation. Not only do we have this destruction, though, but we also see major changes in the settlements and social hierarchy at this very early period. Because of the ever-changing environment, there was a need to find a new way to order society and understand what was happening around the individual people. The movement of people into new areas and this mixing of individuals likely also influenced these changes, and what comes out of this is the later Mycenaeans that we think of today. Understanding this middle Helladic period is not easy. It's not like the Minoan period where we have really clear signs of change and development. But what we can glean from the evidence that we do have is that changes and development, are happening broadly. During the earlier part of this Middle Helladic period, we have less of an understanding of exactly what is happening, but as we move through that period, we're able to pick up on some subtle differences that are occurring and see how the later Mycenaeans pop out, into the Mediterranean. And what we are left with at the end of this Middle Helladic period and the changes that took place is the foundations for what the Mycenaeans will become. A social hierarchy with an elite is created and seen through the mortuary practices that are then present in these areas, and resettlement of previous sites is also occurring, and we see this ever-expanding contact with the Aegean islands and with Crete. And the Minoan and Aegean influence on the mainland was just enormous. While there is evidence of influence on coastal sites for obvious reasons, the influences made it deeper into the mainland too. And it's likely the Minoans who inspired the later palatial structures that are about to start cropping up on mainland Greece. It's really the late Helladic period where the Mycenaeans shine, so that's where we will spend the rest of our time. I don't want to bog you down with the dates too much. I might have already, but a general idea of the time periods that we're looking at is that the broad period that we consider to be the Mycenaean period on the mainland is generally from around 1750 BCE to around 1200 or 1100 BCE, ending with the collapse that we will get to later this month. The people that we think of as Mycenaeans, the palatial citadels where we imagine Helen and Menelaus and Agamemnon and all those figures in the Trojan cycle, all come from this late Helladic period, around the 15th century, down to the collapse in the early 12th. They are not real, to be clear. I hope I'm making it clear enough. At least, we don't know if they're real, but the ideas behind those characters come from this time period when Mycenaeans were kind of at their peak. Last week we focused on the Minoan side of Knossos, but it's a little more difficult to pick one Mycenaean site and still really get a grasp of everything that was happening during the period. What was happening at the site of Mycenae was not necessarily the same as what was happening at Pylos or Thebes or Lerna. For simplicity, and because this is not an entire history course, but one podcast episode that needs to keep me from losing what little remains of my functioning brain, we're mostly going to hang around in Mycenae itself. Maybe pop over to Pylos every now and then. Just remember the Mycenaeans were not a monolith. They were broadly spread out over the mainland. The Minoans weren't either, obviously, but it's a bit harder to wrap your head around when we're talking about a large amount of the Greek mainland rather than, one famously big, but still an island. The very beginnings of Mycenaean culture grow during the late Helladic period until they become this vast and various palatial sites that we often think of now. The most famous of which are probably Mycenae and Pylos, mythological homes to Agamemnon and the great King Nestor. The most important regions for the development of the administrative and cultural centers of the Mycenaean culture, though, are these sites, or just primarily the sites in the Peloponnese, but it does extend into other familiar areas like Attica and Boeotia. For once, though, Athens is not the most important place. Or rather, for once, it isn't the place where almost everything survives from, like is so often the case in later time periods. One of the best things about learning about the Mycenaeans, though, in my opinion, and Michaela's, is that so much of what we know about the development of the culture and the practices come from grave sites. This is for all my goth girlies out there. Keep loving graveyards, because they really do impart just loads of important cultural information. And one of the other most important places to learn about ancient cultures? Trash holes. That is not the technical term, but it does best describe what I'm talking about. Going through ancient people's trash. That's archaeology dreams. Still, like any good weirdo, it's cemeteries that we're going to focus on. cemeteries in the beginning of this late Helladic period start demonstrating higher levels of organization and division amongst the burials. This implies the beginning of social stratification that seems to lean towards familial ties and lineage. High-value grave goods appear in burials, and we start to see differentiation in how the dead are interred. Again, this is something that is going to come up in Friday's conversation. We're going to go into lots more detail because grave goods are awesome. Interestingly, this is diversified across the region, with different areas adopting different burial practices at this beginning kind of periods of this. Things like the shaft graves at Mycenae and the tumuli in regions like Mycenae. These differences, as well as the presence of rich grave goods, suggest that there was a level of maybe competition amongst these elites, with each vying to prove that they are so much more important than the other simply because they can afford to put more swords or jewelry into their grave. It's rich people competing to appear more rich than the other rich people, but spending a seemingly large amount of their living days and money preparing to look rich when they're dead, which is just so fascinatingly ancient. And I mean, good for them, I guess. Rich people have always been weird, but fortunately what this does is show us that there was this emergence of rich people, the elite, in the region. And eventually these grave sites would turn into the large tholos tombs that we can still see today in places like Mycenae. The most famous of these tholos tombs, sometimes called beehive tombs, is called the Treasury of Atreus. And it is, fuck you guys. The tholos tombs are they're so incredibly cool. There's a reason they're sometimes called beehive tombs. They're incredible. Check my Instagram because I intend to post some things that I have from the last time I visited there. They are wild. They are beautiful. The acoustics inside them are bananas. But of course, it is the stuff that was found inside those tholos tombs that gives us the most information about the people who built them, and then the people who were then interred in them. The types of grave goods that appear are incredible examples of just how far-reaching the Mycenaean contacts were within the Mediterranean. Things from places like Crete and the Eastern Mediterranean have been found in these tombs, and so show that not only the Mycenaeans, had well-defined trade contacts along with influence from these other regions, but also, could afford to put them where they're buried and never see them again. But it also implies this influence from the wider area, an influence that was likely driving the political and cultural changes that were happening on the mainland. And what's wild, too, is how much these things indicate the level of wealth, that would have had to been present amongst these elites. They're burying themselves with their wealth rather than passing it down to their descendants. And we know that ancestral lines were important. That's also clear in these burials. But it means that they were all rich enough that they could spare the level of wealth they were being buried with. Which, frankly, is a nice little thing to keep in mind when we look at the collapse and the crash of the elite structures that were, quite literally hoarding wealth in the earth. A little bit of fuck around and find out, perhaps. A little bit of inspiration for the future, even. Over time, the regional differences that we see in the early Helladic period become less pronounced, and influence on the mainland becomes a bit more defined into one thing that we can call Mycenaean. Not entirely, obviously, just more than it had been before. It makes sense, the more these cultures developed and worked together, the more they collaborated, and so things became more similar across the region. Similarly to how the Minoans eventually used Linear B, likely because their continued contact and trading with the Mycenaeans. Still, just like in later Greece, where certain trends are noticeable across the board generally, but we would never say that the Athenians operated in exactly the same way as the Thebans, this is the same for the Mycenaeans. One of the overall themes for the Mycenaeans, which I'm sure no one will be surprised by, is quite a strong emphasis on martial prowess. The Agamemnon of it all. Because, I mean, if we understand that the heroes of the Trojan War originated mythologically from this culture, then the emphasis on military excellence is not in any way surprising. Have you ever Googled a boar-tooth helmet? Go ahead and do that now. On top of all of this, being able to protect yourself in a land that isn't, the most well-known for being able to support large populations is also not at all surprising. It was of utmost importance for the people living on this land and in this very early time period that they be able to support and also protect themselves. The social stratification is important when we consider how it was on Crete, too. On the island, there seemed to have been more focus on the community as a whole and an elite ruling class that kind of worked with the population. But on the mainland, there eventually appears to be more of a focus on an individual chief of sorts, a head of the elite, or at least a leading family within the community and within the elites. Like, small settlements that appeared across the mainland eventually coalesced into a number of key sites that seemed to consolidate, everything together under this leading individual or leading family. And as these sites grew, the need to have an organized administrative system became, increasingly important. The palatial systems start to make their appearance then, small at first and eventually growing as time goes on. As the early Mycenaean period goes on, we see this expansion of Mycenaean powers across the Mediterranean, most notably, again, on Crete, where a number of destructions occur, followed by the adoption of Linear B as the language of administration on the island. Traditionally, this has sometimes been attributed to the Mycenaeans taking over the island, which is a fairly reasonable conclusion, but it's definitely not something that's been agreed upon. I even kind of phrased it that way, saying followed by, but really these things are happening at a similar time. Because it's also just as likely that the Minoans had particularly close ties to the Mycenaeans and therefore adopted Linear B out of convenience or for any other number of reasons. And Linear B is fun. Linear B is fun. I mean, I won't go too deep into it, but it is solidly early Greek. And entirely selfishly, too, thank fuck the Minoans took on Linear B because it means that we can actually read some records from Knossos, which wouldn't be possible if they stayed entirely using Linear A. And it's certainly true that the Mycenaeans were so deeply influenced by the Minoans that it's sometimes difficult to parse out, what is distinctly Mycenaean on the mainland, from the sheer amount of Minoan products and influence that also appears in what remained of their Mycenaean palatial centers. And speaking of, let's spend the last little bit of time that we have with, the Mycenaeans at their height and at the centers that we are so familiar with. From the great sites of the Argolid, which were likely all interconnected in their own ways, Mycenae and Tiryns, further into the Peloponnese at Pylos, and even up into Boeotia at Thebes. There was a settlement in Athens too, I should say, and even a structure on the Acropolis with its Cyclopean walls, but it wasn't important enough to make the cut today. For once, we get to leave Athens out. Just don't tell the Athenians of the classical period, they are the center of the universe. The palatial centers of the Mycenaeans operated in much the same way as the ones on Crete, as the central areas for administration, ceremony, production, and storage for their corresponding areas. The structure of the buildings, though, differed from Crete in that they often had a central room called a megaron that housed a large hearth and possibly was a reception area for whoever was leading the people at the sites. The central figure also appears in a name. We actually have a word for this central figure of the Mycenaean cultures. The word is wanax, and it appears in later Greek as anax, and it meant king, lord, protector, or chief, something of that sort. This is the one greatest distinction between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, where, in the latter, there is eventually this clear leading figure, the Agamemnon of it all. Whereas the Minoans don't necessarily have that, or if they did, we're not sure of it. But the surrounding areas of each Mycenaean settlement, differed from site to site. But what's clear is that there was, major expansion that had happened and was taking place. Mycenae fortified their town with great cyclopean walls and the infamous Lion's Gate that greeted visitors or enemies as they advanced into the citadel. And these walls, like the ones in Athens, took their name from the later people who couldn't fathom, that their mortal ancestors could have built walls so large. And thus, they were cyclopean, built by the Cyclops themselves. Inside the citadels, you don't just find the central palatial building with its megaron, but also buildings that functioned as cult and production centers. These are the areas where the Linear B tablets tend to be found, and which give us lots of information on the economic and cult religious activities that were happening. This is how we see that specialization of certain crafts and crops continued to help each regional economy. At Pylos, we see a booming textile industry where women played a large role, something that is evidenced in the administrative records. There's a lot to say about women in the Mycenaean period, and goddesses too, which will come up heavily in Friday's conversation. I picked brains. Mycenaean pottery, though, too, remained important and spread across the mainland, the Aegean islands, and then all through the Mediterranean. When it comes to cults of worship, the Mycenaean cult shows the beginnings of cult practices that we will see later in the Greek world. Kind of the origins of what will become ancient Greek cult practice and religion broadly. Burnt sacrifices were common, as were libations, and processions seemed to play an incredibly important role in their worship. Minoan influence does appear too, with some sites adopting very recognizable Minoan symbols, like the double axe, but we shouldn't actually assume that this meant, a Minoan cult of worship was established or dominant in any way. It seems that instead, the Mycenaeans used these symbols and various practices within their own understanding of their own cult. Instead, Minoan symbols were just being translated into Mycenaean practices and adapted for whatever use they needed. It's also in this early Mycenaean cult that we can see the beginnings of the gods themselves. The gods that we will come to know and love and hate from later traditions. And they appear in these Linear B tablets that record offerings made to the various deities and sanctuaries. We see evidence of most of the Olympian gods in their earliest forms, along with many mentions of a goddess called Potnia. She's a kind of broad conceptual goddess or mistress of various different things depending on the context. Again, these will come up heavily on Friday's episode. Goddesses were a major question from me. Surprise, surprise. And along with these dedications, though, to these deities, feasting was an important part of their cult practice, something that is seen in the Minoan world and obviously later in the Greek world, in which, it helped to impart a common community amongst its practitioners. And this too, I'm getting too excited, this too is going to come up in a future conversation episode where we look at how much we can learn from animal bones, about the daily lives of these Bronze Age cultures. And as time moves on and the Mycenaeans continue into the late Helladic period, we see the fortifications at these sites grow more and more intense. The walls are built up higher, alternate entrances are added to the citadels, and cisterns are built within the safety of the walls of those citadels. And all this points to something happening on the mainland that is making the people living in these regions uncomfortable. They are nervous, and they are building these walls stone by stone, higher and higher, to keep anything and everything out, while ensuring that they have the resources to provide for themselves within the safety of these walls. And this is, of course, just one small piece of what leads into the Bronze Age collapse. The end of the Mycenaean elites, the end of what we call the Mycenaeans as people, as a culture, but the continuation of everyone else, the regular people who are able to live beyond the collapse of their whole entire societal structure. The collapse, as we will see, was not sudden. There were stirrings long in advance, events that caused the people to feel this need to fortify themselves and their lands from something or someone. But here's the wild thing about the Mycenaeans. The people that we learn about through the Trojan cycle, this mythical history, the very real people behind that entire everything of the Iliad and the Odyssey, really only existed for a short period of time in the grand scheme of ancient Greece and the ancient Mediterranean. The rise and fall of the Mycenaean citadels happened pretty quickly, just a few centuries. That matters very little, though, in, again, the same grand scheme of ancient Greece, because while the actual people we call Mycenaeans were a fairly brief amount of time, or lived for a fairly brief amount of time, their legacy, spanned the whole of the ancient Greek time period, and so far beyond that, you've heard me read the Iliad and the Odyssey. You've seen the new translations coming out to this day. New ways of understanding the stories that came out of this Mycenaean period. Agamemnon may not have been real, but he was inspired by the very real people of Mycenae and all that they left behind. He was developed in the culture that emerged from what was left after the collapse of Mycenae. Still, the very real people of mainland Greece during the Bronze Age were so much more than the myths and the later people were able to see in them. The regular people and their history are so important to remember when thinking about the Mycenaeans, because while we don't see a lot of what those regular people did with their lives, they ultimately were the ones who continued on after all of the elite was gone. After the elite systems crashed, their societies collapsed entirely, the regular people were what was left. They carried the traditions to what we will find in later Greece, the stories, practices, and understandings of their place in the world. We may have the elites to thank for building the sites and being a driving force for some of our later stories, for leaving us the things from which we could learn about them, but they were the people lost in the collapse, and it was everyone else who continued on after it. It was only through regular people who managed to get through a whole lot of mess and lived to keep what they could of their culture alive, to pass it on, until it reached people who may have lost the direct memory of who had lived and why, what they'd done, but it was still those same people who interpreted what the Wanaks and other elite figures left behind, and then gave us the stories that would shape all of ancient Greece. There would never have been an Odysseus without a mainland Greek farmer telling his children stories of their land and what he knew of its past. There could never have been a Clytemnestra rolling out the red carpet for her murderous husband without the individuals who came across the Tholos tombs of Mycenae and imagined that this was where that great avenging queen was laid to rest. Because yes, one of those Tholos tombs does take her name. And so, thank you to the Mycenaeans for my entire life's purpose and career. Oh, nerds. History's fun, isn't it? Friday, my conversation with Dr. Kim Shelton, diving into the details of these ancient Mycenaeans. Oh, I smiled through so much of that episode. I can't wait for you all to hear it. Thank you all for listening. This episode is more than long enough, so let's finish off with a 5-star review from one of you amazing listeners. This came into my inbox at the absolute perfect time, like literally this morning. It's from a user called Rocky Mountain Queen from the States. Came for the myths and stayed for the history. I can't praise this show enough. It's just the right amount of whimsy, realism, and education. I started from episode 1 about a year ago and was hooked immediately. I first heard about this podcast when listening to Ancient History Fangirl and knew I had to find it and listen to it. I'm finally caught up to the present and I've loved seeing how the show has evolved and gotten better with each episode. I love the retellings and explanations of the mythology, but I have to say I have enjoyed the history deep dives more. The Atlantis and Sparta series were great, and I am really looking forward to this new season of Bronze Age Greece. Thank you so much for creating this show and forcing me to think deeper about some of these myths and histories. I truly love every minute of it, from the mythology episodes to the conversation episodes. I definitely have some favorites, but all are wonderful and powerful in their own way. Keep doing what you're doing, and I look forward to more. Thank you for that review, like for so many reasons. They all mean the world to me, but I've been struggling lately a lot. And the history episodes are, in addition to that, like a bit out of my comfort zone, as much as I love them. So I really appreciate the timing of this review and all of the ridiculously nice things you've said about this show and all the many years that I've been doing it. I really appreciate these. I don't think I can say it enough. If you like the show, consider leaving me another review on Apple Podcasts for me to, appreciate. I need to read more on the show, so maybe give me some love. Also, frankly, my fragile mental health could use them. Let's Talk About Myths Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith, Michaela's everything for this season, this series of Bronze Age episodes. It simply would not exist without her for countless reasons. Laura Smith is the production assistant and audio engineer and doing some incredible work on the website. Somehow, soon I'm going to have a slightly more functioning website. You're welcome. The select music in this episode was by Luke Chaos. The podcast is part of the iHeart Podcast Network. Listen on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, and help me continue bringing you the world of Greek mythology and the ancient Mediterranean by becoming a patron. You will get past bonus episodes and more, and hopefully, in the future. Visit patreon.com/mythbaby or click the link in this episode's description. I am Liv, and can you hear my voice going? I love this shit so much. Thank you all for being here. Wow.